to Middle East Consultations 2020. Welcome to the second of a series of monthly webinars. أهلا وسهلا إلى محادثات الشرق الأوسط 2020 وإلى الندوة الشهرية الثانية. I am Lulwa Al-Ma'louf, the Partnerships Manager at ABTS, and I'm glad to see that many of our partners, graduates, church and ministry leaders and friends of ABTS are joining us. أنا اسمي لولو المعلوف، أنا مديرة علاقات الشراكة بكلية اللاهوت. أنا مبسوطة أن نشوف كثير من شركائنا، من طلابنا وخريجينا وأصدقائنا ومن قادة الكنائس والخدمات المسيحية معنا. The purpose of these conversations is to lend Middle Eastern voices to the global discourse on urgent matters of faith and witness. هدف هذه المحادثات تقديم أصوات من الشرق الأوسط حول مسائل ملحة تسود الخطاب العالمي في الإيمان والشهادة المسيحية. This event will be held in English with translation into Arabic. We will be using the interpretation feature of Zoom to offer live translation to Arabic. هذه الندوة ستكون في اللغة الإنجليزية وستترجم للغة العربية. سيكون هناك ترجمة فورية. إذا كنت بحاجة إلى ترجمة للعربية، اضغط على زر التفسير interpretation على خيار اللغة الفرنسية French في زوم، ولا تنسى تسكيت اللغة الإنجليزية بالضغط على mute the original audio. I now turn it over to Brent Hamoud, Programs Coordinator at our Institute of Middle East Studies. He will be moderating this webinar. والآن أترككم مع برنت حمود، منسق البرامج في معهد دراسات الشرق الأوسط، وهو سيدير هذه الندوة.
Thank you, Lilwa. Thank you all for joining us for this second webinar in the MEC 2020 series. It's a pleasure to welcome you here as we find ourselves in the middle of July, in the middle of 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic. We are all well aware of the extent to which life has been disrupted by the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. And one of the areas most affected is that of education, as we have discovered how the measures needed to limit the risks of COVID-19 are directly clashing with so many of the traditional education models of bringing people together physically for instruction and learning. This is impacting programs at all levels, from primary schools to universities, and I believe that all of us would agree that the implications are particularly profound for theological education. Even prior to the pandemic, many seminaries, institutes, and schools were facing major challenges and asking fundamental questions about the aims and methods of theological education in their respective contexts. Then COVID-19 happened, and immediately actions were taken to adapt programs and move teaching online. Some might say that this process was a type of miracle. Others might say that it was a nightmare, but it was certainly an intense experience. And now we find ourselves in a very fluid situation. Little is known about what will happen in the months, even the years to come. And this has presented a tremendous challenge for those who are trying to make decisions about how to move programs forward. So 2020 is certainly a pivotal year for theological education, and it has given us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about, and even more to pray about. One of the most intriguing aspects of the COVID-19 crisis is that it is truly global. Here in the Middle East, we cannot say that the impact has been any more or less severe than other regions. But we do recognize that the Middle East is an extremely complex and convoluted context, even in normal times. And the pandemic has only intensified these ongoing dynamics. And so it's with this intention that the webinar aims to have a conversation that brings these two topics hand in hand. On the one hand, theological education, and on the other hand, the context of the Middle East. We want to explore them together as we consider the situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we seek how to further comprehend the mounting challenges and the emerging opportunities for the people of God to witness to Christ at this unique moment. To carry on this conversation, we have an excellent lineup of panelists who will share with us during this webinar. And I want to briefly introduce them at this time. They should be appearing here for us. So joining us from ABTS here in Lebanon and providing today's keynote presentation, we have Eli Haddad with us. Joining us from Cairo, Egypt, and sharing a case study from the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo, we have Hani Hanna. Also joining us from here in Lebanon, providing a case study from ABTS, we have Martin Akkad. And joining from Dublin, Ireland, to provide a global perspective for this conversation, we have Stephanie Black with us. We look forward to hearing from each of you. Thank you for being with us during this webinar. At this point, I'd like to invite all of you to participate in a poll with us. This is just an opportunity to engage and hear some responses as we kick off this webinar. And as you look through the questions and respond, I do want to share that we will have a panel discussion during this webinar. And you can contribute to this discussion by submitting questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom. And if you see questions that you like, you can also respond by voting or upticking a question. And this will move it up the list and draw it to our attention. Also, at the conclusion of this webinar, we will have a survey, a link to a survey that we would appreciate if you could take a few minutes to respond, to give some feedback, and to help us better develop webinars during this series. Take a few more seconds to complete the poll. Okay, let's see the results. Where are you joining us from? Looks like we have a very fair distribution of participants from within the Arab world and from outside the Arab world. It's wonderful to see familiar names joining us and friends of ours. And we just hope that soon we'll be able to host you here in Lebanon at some point for an event like MEC. How would you characterize the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on theological education? Interesting. It seems highly consequential in both ways, good and bad. It seems as though there is a tension among us as we think about the changes unfolding in theological education and the things that are to be celebrated, the things that are to be lamented. And hopefully this webinar is helpful in understanding the consequential moment that we're in. Third question, do you feel 2020 will mark a turning point in the way theological education is understood, designed, and delivered? Strong response for yes, and the results will be mostly positive. That is extremely encouraging and faith-building as we enter into this conversation, thinking about the ways that theological education is changing, but in faith that it is changing in ways positive. Great. Well, we will now welcome Eli Haddad to share with us a keynote presentation for our webinar. Eli Haddad is the president of ABTS. He is a PhD candidate at the International Baptist Theological Study Center at the Free University in Amsterdam. He teaches in the areas of missional ecclesiology, ethics, and leadership. And Eli, we welcome you and look forward to hearing your insights for us today.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, ABTS, for inviting me to speak on this topic. Let me share my screen here. So we've been hearing a lot is being talked about, especially in the West, about COVID-19, the pandemic, and theological education and the impact of theological education around the world. We've been benefiting a lot from these conversations. What I want to do today in these 15 minutes is to bring in the Middle Eastern perspective, look a little bit at the context that we find ourselves in the Arab world. So what we hear a lot about is okay, we can't have students in the classroom, then we need to look at alternate methods. So we look at online, we look at other stuff. So there's a tendency that most of the focus will go on delivery, answering the how question. So the emergency measures for lockdown or not being able to be in the same classroom, what do we do about that? And this is rightly so. We need to have this kind of focus. And our case studies today will focus a lot on the how-to. What do we do now that we cannot be in the same classroom? How do we move forward? But what I'd like to do in this talk is to reframe the conversation a little bit, is to take it beyond emergency measure. So if we say that theological education should be fit for purpose, that means what's happening in our world should impact theological education, which means that the impact of the pandemic, the impact of COVID-19 goes way beyond what we need to do as an emergency measure. It's changing our world, and if our world is changing, then that should change theological education. The content of our training becomes of utmost importance. So basically, the needs in our society should drive the ministry of the church. And the ministry of the church, what the leaders of the church needs to be equipped with, should really direct the content of theological education. So we want to look a little bit about the needs in our society and what kind of training our church leaders need, so that we know what theological education post-COVID-19 should look like. I want to start by going to pre-pandemic. What have been the challenges in our society pre-pandemic? I want to take us back to our Middle East consultation 2017, where we focus on the church in disorienting times. By the way, this has been published in a book, and I'm glad to see that our editor, Jonathan Andrews, is with us today participating. So in this consultation, what we did is we highlighted 4 different dimensions of challenges that we face in our societies. And this is 2017, pre-COVID-19. The first one is suffering and persecution. And the outcome that we came up with during that consultation is for the dimension of suffering and persecution, the church has a role in addressing and critiquing the systems of power in any society, especially the structures of oppression. And the church needs to consider its relationship with Muslims and Islam. If we're serving in a Muslim context, then this should be reflected in the ministry of the church. The second dimension was of immigration. And the outcome was the church has a role in inspiring their young leaders and in igniting a sense of calling and purpose for what God is doing in the region. There is a role the church needs to play when we have challenge of immigration. The third dimension is hopelessness and despair. So for that, the church can be, and in disorienting times needs to be, the agent of transformation in society. And the fourth dimension that we talked about was minoritization. So the response of the church should be, the church can help change our thinking by rejecting the notion of minoritization. The church can help change our emotions by leading a healing process. And the church can help change our behavior by bringing us back to the public square. Now, we've been discussing and reflecting a lot at ABTS at what are the new challenges that we experience in our societies due to the pandemic, due to COVID-19. What are increased challenges that we're facing? I'm going to provide a list. We will not have enough time to go deep into them. There's a dimension of dealing with a lot more death, grief, and loss. There's increased poverty, joblessness, increased crime. Livelihoods are being lost, so that has a big impact on our societies. There's a lot of isolation and depression, especially during periods of lockdown. Strained relationships, family, level of church, level of society. And we've read a lot about increased domestic abuse. And the church tends to feel a bit disconnected, fragmented, lack of vision. No one has prepared us for something like this. When the church cannot meet face-to-face, then that's a new challenge for the church. There's a loss of meaning and despair, even more acute during this COVID-19 crisis. Issues of health and healthcare are of utmost importance during these times. Understanding the role of the church. So we find ourselves that we have to go back to church history to find out how the church has responded in periods like this one that we have not seen before. Ministry becomes costly. If you want to do ministry when it's risky, then it becomes costly. Inadequate crisis governance. Again, we're not prepared for a period like this. Church leadership can be overwhelmed because we're under pressure. There are so many levels of pressure that leaders have to deal with. So what does this mean? What does this mean for training leaders? If these are the new increased challenges that we find in our societies, then how do we ought to train leaders differently? Number one, we need more counseling, more on self-dependence, generosity, self-giving, stewardship, a lot more skills in fighting poverty. We're having to deal with levels of poverty that we have not seen before. More on the identity and role of the church in a time like this. Does the church get involved, or does the church stay silent? More on relationships within the family, within the church, within society, within government. More skills in conflict management and reconciliation, theology of total embrace. Basically, church as a wounded healer. The way Henry Nouwen puts it is the service of the church will not be perceived as authentic unless it comes from a heart wounded by the suffering about which it speaks. So it means that if we're not wounded ourselves and we come from that perspective, then how can we help those who are wounded? And we need a lot on skills on peace building. Which leaders do we need to train to counter these new challenges? Church-based leadership, NGO ministry-based leadership, marketplace-based leadership, workplace-based leadership, thought leaders. So all these levels of leaders need to be trained differently for the church to have good impact in a time that's post-COVID-19. Now, what are the challenges that face our seminaries? There are challenges that have been facing our seminaries for a long time. Pre-pandemic, we are severely under-resourced, financial and human. Our seminaries always suffer from being under-resourced. We suffer from poor infrastructures, and that has to do a lot with being under-resourced. We suffer from government restrictions. We don't always have the freedom that we need to do the work that we need. We suffer from traditional imported curricula. The curricula that we tend to use in our seminaries are imported from the West. They're designed for different time, different place, different sets of challenges. And the curricula that we import are usually not holistic. There's a lot on the cognitive, there's a lot on Bible and theology, and rightly so, but there isn't a lot on other aspects, and there isn't a lot on the ability and the skill to read the needs of the society and how we can deal with that. So these have been some of our challenges. And we've had a lot of experience in operating in a volatile region. We're used to disruptions, and that becomes apparent when something happens and we're disrupted. We can't go to class. It's easy for our seminaries to find quick solutions, emergency solutions, because we live in a volatile region where we have to make adjustments all the time. And we're ready to make these kinds of quick adjustments. Now let's look at some new challenges that we face as theological schools in the Middle East as a result of the pandemic. One, there's even more increased migration, brain drain. Now, as the airports are opening up, young people are lining up to leave to places where they have better economic opportunities, better living conditions. Even more severe financial challenges because we depend on the outside to fund most of our operations, and as there is a lot of pressure on the outside, economic pressures as well, we tend to feel them as well. Low percentages, preparedness, I mean, for the use of technology. We're not as prepared for technology. And we're averse to major change, innovation, and risk-taking. We tend to adjust in this volatile region, but we make slight adjustments and then we go back to normal whenever we can. There's increased impact of inadequate theology. This is always an issue. Is the theology adequate for ministry in the Arab world? To give an example, I've been noticing this a lot, and I see it in our churches and almost everywhere. We all want to train our leaders to become Christ-like. All churches, they want to train their congregation to become Christ-like. Well, what does that mean, Christ-like? What's the content of that Christ-likeness? And it's interesting to see that for the churches that see Christ as balanced, as measured, as safe, then the response to the crisis, to the pandemic, is balanced, is measured, is safe. We want to protect ourselves first, we want to protect our community first, and then we'll think about ministry. However, if we see Christ as not balanced, but rooted, radical, unsafe, then being Christ-like means something totally different to us, being out there, where it's risky, where it's costly, where there's a big expense to pay. So having adequate understanding of theology, of Jesus, of his teachings, of his example, will impact a lot of what we do in our societies. So as we reflect a lot at ABTS, what does it mean to have a strategic response, to move beyond the emergency measures? And few things keep showing up. We need to stick to the mission that we believe God has called us to do. There's no compromise on the mission. There needs to be a lot of community discernment. There will be difficult decisions to make. How can we make them in a way that we are able to discern what God wants us to do next for this next season of ministry? Reducing to the essentials. We tend to grow in peaceful times, and then when it gets tough, then we need to get the fluff out so that we can focus on what's essential, what's important. We need to be ready to give up what has worked well for a number of years, give up things that we are attached to, so that we're able to find new ways of doing things differently. We need to have a lot of innovation. We want to prepare our schools for the future, not for the past. And this will require a lot of collaboration. You will see us reflecting a lot on these points as we think through them and we try to find out what they mean to us. Basically, if I want to end with this, never waste a good crisis. A crisis like the pandemic is something terrible. It's traumatic for so many people. There's a lot of pain and suffering. But crisis is always a good platform for ministry, good platform for the gospel. It's a time where people are looking for meaning. It's a time where people are looking for purpose. It's a time where there's a lot of darkness and our light needs to shine a lot more. So it's a pity for us to waste all of these needs in our societies when the church can have an answer, can be agent of transformation, can be agent of hope, can be agent of peace. And if we want the church to be that kind of agent, then we need to take every opportunity as theological education, theological schools, to prepare leaders for different type of ministries that can have an effect in a dark region like the one we're passing through. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli, for that insightful presentation, presenting the challenges and the opportunities that are facing not just theological institutions in the Middle East, but churches and faith communities. You've given us much to think about, and I'm sure we'll explore these topics more in the discussion time. But just reflecting quickly, the idea that a crisis is only perhaps tragic if wasted. And one of the lessons that we've learned in the Middle East in this decade, this past decade, is that crisis creates opportunity for the Gospels, as you shared, and that gives us hope at this time. If you have a question for Eli, if you have something you'd like to ask him, a point you would like to go deeper on, please submit a question in the Q&A, and we will try to address that later on in the webinar. I now want to bring us to the case study portion of the webinar. We'll hear on the ground, within the institutions, within the churches, what the experience has been in the Middle East during this pandemic. And I first welcome Hani Hanna to share with us a case study from the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo. Hani has been the academic dean of ETSC and received a PhD in systematic theology from Princeton Theological Seminary. He's also an ordained Presbyterian minister. And Hani, we welcome you and look forward to hearing your news, your report from the church in Egypt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brent, for the introduction, and thanks to ABTS for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening in order to share with you the experience of ETSC during this terrible pandemic. Well, I would like to start with an analogy around which I structure my case study presentation. This analogy is the analogy of wind. Wind. You know, in John 3, there's talk about the Spirit of God blows, and you hear it sound. You see the effect, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. Because we're not talking today about the wind of the Holy Spirit, which is productive and edifying. Today, I liken the coronavirus with a wind. The coronavirus is a kind of wind, stormy one though, and of course it's disruptive. Everybody on the globe has felt this and its effect on every aspect of life. But at the same time, there are some sort of silver lining, if I may say, that we could learn from. And here I'll just pick up where Dr. Haddad left off. We're talking about never waste an opportunity. So there are challenges, definitely, about the COVID-19 crisis, but also there are opportunities, silver linings. And out of this and that, there are certain pointers towards the future. So I'm structuring my case study around these three main concepts: challenges, opportunities, and pointers to the future. So challenges. Well, like everyone else, every institution, every country, ETSC has experienced a lot of challenges in relation to the COVID-19 during the last few months. Well, first of all, of course, and it's obvious, it's the fear of infection. Unfortunately, we have like 5 families of our community that have suffered an infection, viral infection, and thank God they are totally recovered right now, and for that we praise the Lord. But it is an ongoing fear that this might happen again to any other member of our family. So the obvious move towards an online education, it was a bit of a challenge. It was not a very big challenge for us because 5 years ago we started an online education plan where one of our major programs, the NAT, was prepared to be available fully online. And right now, although this is a challenge, it took us some time in order to, of course, build new courses that were not available online in order to accommodate residential programs that are now hosted on an online platform due to the COVID-19. But because we started that move early, we feel like this was like a prophetic move that we took 5 years ago. So it is a challenge, but at the same time, it is a way, it is also a time of celebrating God's work in our midst, and sensing and feeling God's direction and guidance of ETSC throughout the years, by actually coming to see how an earlier move actually is right now is playing off in a very beneficial way in the life of ETSC. Although, of course, we have further challenges that have to do with online education. Of course, the internet connection is poor in certain areas of Egypt, especially in underprivileged areas, and most of them are rural areas. And some of our students come from rural backgrounds. Although they are smart and they are dedicated and they are called for ministry, but at the same time, because of the poor infrastructure, and it's not just the financial aspects of the matter, but also the skeletal aspect of the matter. So you could have the money to get a new and a good stable internet connection, but the infrastructure wouldn't allow you to. So that was a major challenge that we have faced at ETSC, how to help our students receive online education in order to continue their programs and their studies, and to continue pursuing their calling in a meaningful way during this time, in the midst of these two challenges: the financial challenge and the I would say the contextual challenge of the infrastructure, the poor infrastructure in certain parts of our country. So we had to make decisions to actually provide our students with financial support, and in order to get good internet connection. Of course, this helped at some level, but it didn't help with help the students where they live, who live in a poor infrastructured areas. But we tried to find different solutions to do this. And actually, some of our students, they had to move in order to get a better service that could allow them to continue their education. So we had to shift our budget a little bit in order to enable our students to get a good internet connection. Of course, there's another aspect of the challenge of the COVID-19, which has to do with the core of theological education in our seminary, which has to do with formation. That's the core of what we're doing. It's an academic, personal, and spiritual formation of those who are called to ministry in order to enable them to be the best that they could be, and they set the calling. Their calling in their lives and the needs of the church in this part of the world in the coming decades. So, but now we are just deprived of this opportunity, especially with the residential program, which is the MDiv program that we have at ETSC. So we had to come up with different solutions in order to tackle this challenge. So of course, the obvious solution is to have a chapel, an online chapel, and that went rather well. Of course, not perfectly well, but it was a good opportunity where we gathered ethereally over Zoom in order to worship together on a weekly basis. Of course, the fellowship had to take a different shape. So instead of, we had we call it care groups, where people get together and spend some time in fellowship, prayer, for their lives, for the seminary, for the country, for ministry, etc. But now we can't do it. So we started actually working on different axes. So online axes in a group form, but also individually. So one of the opportunities that we discovered during the COVID-19 is that we can actually enrich our individual relationship with each other. Although we are deprived of a bigger opportunity to meet as groups, so the social aspect, especially with the emphasis on social distancing or physical distancing, but now we can have actually individual relationships with each other. So we started capitalizing on this capacity and this opportunity by doing this over phone, online format, like in Zoom or other social networking capacities. One of the main assets of ETSC and its curriculum development is its internship program. We have a very strong internship program that constitutes about 18 credits of the MDiv program, and up to 12 credits in our NAP program. But right now, because the churches got closed and people can't go to churches, not just to pray and worship, but also to minister and to do their internships at churches. And the same applies in like NGOs and other places where they put some limitations on the work time and work limits. So we shift our strategies during that time in order to take advantage of this opportunity and turns around. So instead of like standing in front of the wind and get broken, we turned our back to the wind and we changed our strategy and our thinking about internships. So our internships right now, currently, and for the foreseeable future, is focusing on training our students how to do online ministry from homes, from their home, in order to overcome this and take this as an advantage of them to learn new skills in ministry, and how to do this in different formats, not only by phone, and which is an effective method, but also during using Facebook, and you're just learning new skills on how to build an effective communication with clear objects and clear strategy in order to realize the goal that they want. So dealing with internships has been a blessing in which we experience like shifting in strategies in order to face the situation. So another challenge, and it's not only about the how-to, which Eli has pointed us to, but also about the content. So not also about the methodology, which obviously is like, moving towards an online platform, but also about the content. Do we need to change the theological content of our education? And we have been grappling with this. And one of the opportunities that we have is like the questions that kept rising from the church. Of course, our churches are closed, and people are yearning for communal gatherings, for fellowship, Christian fellowship, for participating in the Lord's Supper, and all these are very dear desires, needs for spiritual life and for social life, and people are just they just want to get together and for prayer, worship, and participating in the Lord's Supper. And all kinds of questions popped up about the possibility of actually having the Lord's Supper, in an online format or quasi-online format, or in a hybrid format, temporarily in this pandemic time. And one of the initiatives that ETC took was actually to provide a study for this in order to a creative one that emphasizes the importance of social gathering around Jesus Christ, present spiritually and in the practice of the Lord's Supper, but at the same time taking into account the current context. So a paper was written in order to help the church think. The paper didn't mean to like decide for the church, but to help church think about this and help the church go about discussing it and come to a conclusion that could help the church go through this in the best way possible and think creatively about this. So the theological content needs to be addressed in creative ways during the crisis. So what does it mean to be a community? This is one of the questions that we have been grappling with right now, and I think it needs more time in order to do work on it. What does it mean to be a community, especially if we can't get together? This is another question that needs to be addressed. Of course, right now we're in the middle of the crisis. Like, we're not just looking back, we're also looking to the present, and we're looking to the future. So those are few questions that we've been grappling with in a time of crisis, but also in a time with great opportunities and great capabilities, which we call the technological capabilities. How can we use this and look at this as a blessing that we could use in order as we face this crisis? Of course, another challenge, although that we look at our online program as a blessing and as like a prophetic move that we made a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, but right now we became more and more aware of the essential need to have an e-library and a digital library. Our master's programs are research programs. So research on the master level, even on the bachelor level, but especially on the master's level, are research-based programs mainly. And this requires a library. Well, you know, students used to come to the seminary where we have a good library and they go to the library and use the books. But if we provide online education, now we need a good online library with good Arabic resources to support research so that students could, you know, do the work and study and learn and write the papers, etc. So another silver lining that we found during this crisis is that we could actually use the time more efficiently. Especially if you live in Cairo, you would really appreciate this because in Cairo it takes you forever to get from some place to another because of the terrible traffic. But the online work from home actually helped us save some time. This helped faculty members a lot. A great deal. Why? Because now they have more time to focus on their writing project, which is an important thing at the top of our priorities, but at the same time, because of the overwhelming administrative and teaching load, it just, you know, the priority goes down on the list. But now we have the opportunity to focus on our writing. So many of our faculty members started projects and actually finished projects, and they hope to finish the writing projects soon. One of the things that we grappled with during the pandemic is ethical in terms of our relationship with our staff and our students and our community. Many people suffered during this crisis, and this was a time for us to exercise ethical responsibilities by actually getting together and provide ways in order to help people get through this by providing support as a community. The same thing has to do with there was no layoff of any person at the community, and this was something that we are thankful that we could pull off, which is a challenge. And at a time of crisis, it is time that tests your priorities, it tests your beliefs, it tests your relationships, everything. So this is something that we've been challenged, and we hope that we don't have to do that in the near future because of the pressing needs and the pressing financial challenges. Vision for the future. Okay, I think my time is up, so I'll just share with a couple of things. Of course, it's obvious that we need to revisit how we use our budget, how we build our budget in a way that is meaningful because of the needs that right now we become more aware of. The post-corona budget is not like pre-corona budget. It should differ, and definitely part of it will have to do with some online stuff, technology. We're becoming more and more aware of the need for e-library. So much of our resources will need to be redirected in order to have this in place in order to support our online education. So those are very obvious things. Now, the way we think about space. Sometimes you could have like big projects in your mind, like extending your space and stuff like that. Right now, with certain decisions that impels you to or compels you to go back home and work from home, how we should think about space. So there are so many things that we are grappling with right now. No decisions made. Of course, residential programs, how we can integrate elements of online education into our residential programs, not just to face a crisis right now, but to open up opportunities for the future. Of course, we could talk about this for a very long time. Well, thanks so much for the time I was given to share the ETC's experience, and all the best wherever you are. And I hope that you survive this pandemic with the least amount of loss and with great visions for the future. Blessings.
Thank you, Hani, for that inspiring and encouraging report, testimony from where you are in Egypt. And here in MEC, we love metaphors, we love imagery. So your picture of the wind is right at home here in MEC. I guess for much of us, it's felt like this virus, this pandemic has been a wind to our face, and this picture of turning and letting the wind push us is a beautiful picture as we consider the opportunities at this time. We will now hear our second case study. Martin Akkad will share from a report from ABTS. Martin is the Chief Academic Officer at ABTS. He's also the Director of the Institute of Middle East Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Oxford, and he teaches in the area of Islamic studies. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you very much, Brent. Thank you. Great thanks to my colleagues, Eli Haddad, Hani in Egypt, and I look forward to the next presentation as well by Stephanie Black. I want to greet everyone around the world. It's actually wonderful. I don't know whether all of you realize, but we are 107 people in this webinar enjoying this conversation and sharing of ideas. And I'm going to look briefly at the recent journey of ABTS through these difficult times of pandemic. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take two steps. The first is, or two angles. The first is to look at the process of transition. And the second step will be to look at the process of transformation through what I will continue to call a metamorphosis. You may remember, for those of you who were with us last month in our June Middle East conversation, that I was, in my keynote, I explored three metaphors for the crisis. The first metaphor that I use or refer to was the metaphor of the storm. And this is like this bird sitting on that corner, trying to live in denial about what's happening around us. This is not happening. We will come out of this. Life will return to normal as we always knew it. We comfort ourselves. The second metaphor that I proposed was the tunnel metaphor. And the focus with the tunnel metaphor is on the urgent. And focusing on the urgent is often done at the expense of the strategic. Financial survival takes priority. And I have seen organizations, seminaries that have made bad decisions in times of crisis because their priority was financial survival, and we forget the strategic, and we do that at the expense of the strategic because we are concerned with survival. But then I explored the third metaphor that I called the cocoon metaphor. And I would say today that the metaphor of the cocoon is the ability to focus on the strategic without ignoring the urgent. The focus here is not saving ourselves, is not praying for a return to normal. The focus here is on remaining faithful. Our priority is to remain faithful. And I think the focusing on the strategic without ignoring the urgent is the best way that we can remain faithful, both to the legacy that has been handed down to us, but also to the values and the culture of the kingdom of God. So looking at the process of transition that we have gone through, I would say that hands down, the most important decision that we ever made at our first crisis management meeting when COVID-19 was upon us was we immediately, or let's say by the middle of that meeting, roughly, we decided to separate the conversation about the urgent from the one about the strategic. And it's not that we separated it into two different teams and we gave one team to discuss urgent matters and how to save the seminary, and the other team how to think strategically about the future. No, and I think that's important. It was the same team that was tasked with dealing with urgent matters as well as thinking strategically. But from the very first meeting, we decided we will have one meeting on the strategic issues, and then we will have at a different time a meeting on finances, and then another one on strategic issues, and so on. So here are some of the things that I would put under the urgent that we had to deal with immediately, and that probably reflects the experience of many of you out there who work in theological education. Of course, the most obvious thing was our students. What do we do with our students? We typically at ABTS have between 40 and 45 students living in residence, and suddenly we have a situation of a pandemic and a very frail health system in Lebanon. We could very easily have ended up with a disaster on our hands. And so we had to make a very quick decision on what to do with our students in order to keep them safe and healthy. The decision right from the first meeting was we have to send our students home. We have to ensure that they get home safely, which took us, frankly, by surprise ourselves. We never thought entering that meeting that within an hour we would have made the decision that we would have to send the students home. Looking at it in retrospect, that was definitely the most important decision we had to make. Now, a caveat, a large proportion of our students were Sudanese, and the airport in Khartoum closed before, right on, as our students were getting ready to leave for the airport. So I greet our Sudanese students, many of whom are today participating in this conversation and are sitting in their rooms in isolation with social distance on the ABTS campus still. And we are still praying and working very hard on getting them home as soon as possible. You need the alignment of many things, like 2 airports open at the same time, not closing while an airplane is mid-air, that sort of thing. The second urgent matter was programs. How do we finish the academic year? And I cannot be more amazed at how God has been preparing our seminary and other seminaries in the region for such times as these. We had, within 2 weeks, we were able to shift completely online. We had already been building an online infrastructure that immediately was taken to its maximum capacity and that sort of thing. And the third area of urgent need, as I already mentioned, is the financial. How do we ensure financial continuity? And we immediately decided to apply the principle, which I like to call the Robin Hood principle. We decided that rather than immediately trimming away some of our colleagues, staff that we might have considered less strategic to those difficult times, we decided if we trim from those with the highest pay, then we make the greatest savings. Of course, guess who was sitting in that room making these decisions? Those of ABTS with the highest pay. So it was not easy to apply kingdom values of care and justice, but that's what we're called to do in these times of crisis. The second area that I'll explore quickly with you all is the process of transformation through metamorphosis. What happens in that cocoon? And here we come to the strategic. Again, here I want to touch quickly on three areas. Of course, this is not exhaustive in any way, barely scratched. I want to propose a general perspective and a spiritual perspective, and then a specific perspective. The general perspective was to ask, what does the present crisis mean for theological education? We had to leave aside our instinct for survival in order to be able to think, what is this going to mean for theological education in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years? And clearly what we concluded was that this was going to accelerate recent trends. Online learning, the idea of apprenticeship as a model for theological education, a methodology adopting a problem-solving framework. It was going to affect a church seminary, collaboration, and so on. The second perspective was to adopt a spiritual perspective. And we had to ask, how do we understand the crisis in light of what God had already been telling us? Because it's, I think we can believe, we can trust that if we are attentive to God's guidance and to His Holy Spirit as we do theological education, as we do any kind of ministry, as we serve God, then God, who knows all things in advance, surely must be preparing us for the most difficult times. And so we had been thinking for a number of years at that point that we need to seek the students that are the most strategic. And I salute all our students, many of whom are attending and participating in this conversation today. And they have had to make so many sacrifices to be able to be with us for 3 years, leaving everything behind, some of them even their family, selling property, abandoning jobs that they had been in for years, selling their businesses and so on. But in addition to these, there are many who, because of their involvement on the ground in ministry constantly, are not able to come and leave everything and study at ABTS or at other seminaries. And so this was the opportunities to seek students that are the most strategic, the leaders in the field who cannot leave and come to Lebanon. We knew this was one thing that we had to do more, to pay more attention to. This pandemic has forced us into it. We had to dare to shatter our idols. We have to continue to dare to shatter our idols. A seminary like ABTS, who since 1960, for 60 years now, has been doing the same thing effectively, with God's blessing, having students come to us, giving them theological education here, investing in their lives, mentoring them, tutoring them. Suddenly we have to move to a system where students would not come to ABTS anymore. Well, the pandemic pushed us to something we knew we had to get to. And so we celebrate the fact that we were able to do that. Thirdly, a specific perspective. How and what does it mean specifically, this crisis? What does it mean for the future of ABTS programs? We are rethinking completely our delivery modes. That's the most obvious thing. Online tools have become crucial, strategic, a priority. We're pursuing innovative trends in theological education. And here I go back to this, the thinking about theological education as an apprenticeship. Our students are in the field, in their church, involved in ministry. They're not away or in a bubble for 3 years. What does that mean? How do we interact with the reality that they are living in as we help them grow into the leaders that God is leading them into? This idea of a problem-solving framework. Students will be doing a lot of their studying online. We will be interacting with them. We want to go from a general theory that we give them, a theological framework that we give them, and then ask them to apply it, to actually saying, what are your challenges in the field? Bring them into the classroom, bring them online into the forums. Let's agree on what you're going to focus on. Let's problem solve together so that you can serve your church more effectively. And then this church seminary collaboration, it's the most obvious one. We, like no other time before, will and are becoming the partners of the local churches in theological education. How will we partner more effectively with them? How will we journey together alongside with the students in this growth into leadership, effective leadership? We are at least three parties in this formational process: the seminary, the church, the student. Some of you may think, isn't that the obvious thing? Not as obvious as one might think when you have been doing things for decades in the same way. We have been investing differently than we were before, investing in virtual infrastructure rather than physical infrastructure. The most significant change or decision that we made is we were in the process of building a new building as a facility for living quarters for our students. Well, you can guess how much money we're going to save on that one, and how we can reinvest some of these resources with the blessing of our partners and donors around the world on more strategic areas that this current crisis has imposed on us. In closing, we have no plan B. So many people that I'm seeing around us, the schools of my children, of our children, they're giving us 3 scenarios, 2 scenarios for next year. We have no plan B. We are continuing to transition, and we're going through this process of metamorphosis. We will never be the same again because of this crisis, and because God has challenged us to follow him in a journey that he knew very well in advance, and which he has drawn us into, and we celebrate that even as we journey with the global church in all of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for that passionate testimony of what is happening here in ABTS, and the faith of having a plan A and nothing else. We're encouraged by the report. If you have any questions for Hani from ETSC, or if you have any questions from Martin about what's happening at ABTS, feel free to submit those to the Q&A. Now we want to hear from Stephanie Black to provide a global perspective to this conversation of theological education during this time of pandemic. Stephanie is the Associate Director for Orientation and Training with Theologians Without Borders, and she is involved in many endeavors in global education, theological education. She is also an affiliate associate professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary and an ordained minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Stephanie is based in Dublin, Ireland, and we are so thankful that you're with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. It's such a privilege for me to be here, and just fascinating for me to hear the in-depth stories that Hani and Martin have shared with us. We've had 2 really interesting and very different snapshots of what those 2 institutions are doing. And so what I get to do for a few minutes with us is just to put that in the context of the global trends that Theologians Without Borders is seeing among the schools in our networks. This would be primarily in Africa and Asia. Just like your 2 schools, everyone was sort of suddenly caught in March as the extent of COVID-19 and what it would mean for all of us became apparent. So just some things that we're noticing. I'm going to give you some general trends, and then I'm going to introduce you to a few specific schools so you can see some of the things that they've discovered. One of the things that we've noticed is a real difference in the experience between the bigger, more established institutions and, of course, the smaller, less resourced institutions. Both Hani and Martin were able to tell you how they had already been in the process of developing quite an extensive online program. And we're seeing a lot of that at the bigger schools. For instance, one of the seminaries in South Asia had told us, we've already been thinking about online education for the last 2 years, but this sort of really dumped us in the deep end. They were already in a plan for developing. He said to some extent we were prepared, but mentally we had to fast track. And I also heard a similar thing from one of the schools in Nigeria. You know, they were 3 years into a 6-year plan to develop a great deal of online education, and then suddenly they said that you know, everything came on us in March, and we realized we weren't quite as well organized as we thought. On the other end, I hear from smaller schools, one in Uganda, that's a fairly new school, and they said to us, we're in a situation whereby we are trying to do something and to figure out how to do something at the same time. So this kind of online transition was quite new to them. The other big difference that we're seeing is between schools that primarily focus on postgraduate level, master's, PhD, other research degrees, and schools that primarily focus on post-secondary training, that would be diploma or degree. And a lot of it has to do with the capacity of the students at the different levels. So post-grad students are generally, they're more likely to have their own laptops or smartphones. They're a little older, a little more experienced. They might have more internet access. Certainly, they're more experienced in the kind of self-directed study that online education requires. And often postgraduate courses are smaller, so it's easier to sort of corral and organize your students into a new format. On the other hand, the post-secondary students, the diploma degree level students, that's been a little harder for a lot of institutions. These students are younger, they're less likely to have their own laptops or smartphones, less likely to have easily accessible internet access. They're certainly less experienced in self-directed study. A lot of them are just learning how to learn in their theological institutions, particularly those in the first year. And often those post-secondary classes are larger. You may have up to 100 students sometimes in some of these classes, and it's a lot harder to connect them, to manage them, and to track them, see how they're doing. One of the reasons I say that is if you are listening to Hani or Martin and you're thinking, oh, we're not anywhere near that, and you're leading a smaller school with perhaps in a more remote area, focusing on post-secondary programs, don't worry, it's not you. Give yourself some grace, because others at your level are also finding some real challenges. Not to be surprised, internet connectivity is a big issue. Across the world, people are telling us, sure, in the cities and larger towns, we have more reliable access. Our smaller towns, our rural areas, we have a lot more trouble getting our students connected. And in general, we found that Asia has better internet infrastructure to date than most parts of Africa do. It's interesting, in terms of the connectivity, one seminary in Indonesia told us that one of the consulates from another major country nearby gave them a grant to improve their Wi-Fi capacity. In Uganda, we heard that the universities together, and that includes the theological colleges there, are actually lobbying the government together to make internet cheaper and more available for universities and for their students. All under the rubric of saying the government has wanted us to move into online education in the 21st century, and this has revealed where we lack in terms of capacity. So there's a lot of conversation going on between the schools and government in that. As you probably also know, even when a school is internet ready, the students and some of the faculty may face challenges. Besides limited access to internet, where there is internet for the students, it may be quite expensive and they may not have the capacity to do that, or they may have it and they can pay for it, but there are power outages, which mean that they cannot count on when they will be able to log in. And even where those things are not a problem, we're finding that families are telling us, look, we have one laptop that we share among a mom, a dad, and several kids who are all trying to work and study and access different online venues at the same time. So there's all kinds of challenges going there. Some of the strategies we're seeing people use for that are, of course, they are trying to reduce the number and length of synchronous video meetings. That is when everyone has to log in at the same time. They're trying to make more things recorded. Even if they have a Zoom meeting, not everyone can come. They'll record it, they'll upload it on YouTube or wherever, so that students can log in when they have the opportunity. People are genuinely moving to lower bandwidth ways of connecting with each other, usually phone-based, WhatsApp or whatever your regional favorite is. And they use those primarily. They'll use the synchronous, the Zoom or the Google Meet meetings maybe once a week or less to kind of set up, get the students to find out what they need to do in the next aspect of their course, and then they'll switch to the phone-based apps in terms of following up as groups, in terms of the class discussion, in terms of students sending in writing papers, taking pictures of them, and sending them in by phone. And a number of institutions are doing what Hanny mentioned, and that they're trying to figure out if they can provide grants or tuition rebates to help the students access the internet and or to upgrade the gadgets or devices they have to go online. And of course, also what's happening is a lot of instructors are facing challenges adjusting their teaching methods. One of the big, really well-equipped seminaries told us, even though that's the case, only 20 or 30% of their faculty were ready and able to offer courses completely online. But one of the things we're really excited about is that we're seeing that these faculty members are really trying, and they're trying out all kinds of things. They're learning quickly, and they're realizing that they can do it. And so they are discovering that there are all kinds of opportunities. And some of them are saying that it makes them better teachers. Just a few quick glimpses of what we've been doing. Theologians Without Borders has been having conversations with some of our schools and our networks in different parts of the world. And we're sharing that in a series of videos, short videos, 10, 12, 15 minutes. You go to our website, you can see those. But I wanted you to have a chance to hear what some of them have been doing in terms of never waste a good crisis. I loved what Ellie did in terms of presenting that to us. So as we've been sharing these interviews, we've been asking different institutions, what have been the unexpected benefits? What have been the blessings of what you're discovering? And here's what a few of them have had to say. Nigerian Baptist Seminary says, we've realized that we actually can do some good work online. They have realized they can capture a wider population of students, some who couldn't get to the seminary because of jobs or other issues. This is a very large, more than 100-year-old school who is used to having a big residential program that feels like a family. And they're grieving that, but they're also discovering that they can bring people in that couldn't have been part of that otherwise. And then they also discovered we can engage a wider variety of facilitators for courses, particularly at postgraduate level. They're bringing in part-time international lecturers who normally might not have had the time or been able to get a visa to come and work with their students for a little bit of each course. In India, the smaller school found that with all of the different resources out there and not really knowing what would be best, that they could go through trial and error and figure out what worked best for them. For them, it was Google Meet. They said it's simple to use, there's less data consumption, less storage, you can do it on an Android device. And they like the idea that it also has captions so that if videos or voice are not clear, then it's easy for the students to connect. There's a school in Uganda that discovered that they were actually going to save a good bit of money, Martin mentioned to this, because they pay an outrageous amount of money for water and electricity, and that's because of their context in Uganda. But they realized that by focusing money on their infrastructure. In Angola, one of the students told me that, one of the instructors told me that she got this excited text from one of her students saying, that textbook is really good. Normally the students, she said, don't really use, they're not self-directed in learning, they don't read the textbook. But by being out there with good resources that they've been able to send them, they're realizing that they can teach themselves and that the resources can actually help. In Indonesia, one person said, one of the leaders said, it's like a test for everybody. For students, it's truly a test of motivation and maturity. And for faculty, it's a test of working through our materials and seeing what's best. They describe that as a benefit and also a challenge. And along with these same lines, one of the schools in Mongolia told us, first our teachers struggled, but now we're encouraged that they can do even more than they thought. They can do this. Some even told me their way of teaching is upgraded. They said preparing their PowerPoints and all things very carefully is actually encouraging them to learn new things. And then just the last one to mention to you, a school in Colombia told us that they have found that they can have an incredible reach into their country that they did not know before. They started a series of forums, a bit like this one. The first one, they had 1,600 views. They recognized that that means that that's a lot more people thinking about engaging with their school. They even said, this happens to be in Sri Lanka, and they even said that they had overseas Sri Lankans who were interested in registering for some of these online courses. They said it's opening up a new opportunity for us. So never waste a good crisis. With Theologians Without Borders, our prayer is that God will guide you in the best openings that he has for you in this new and an unknown situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that report from seminaries and institutions and Bible schools around the world. And yes, it is encouraging to discover that in the midst of difficulties, challenges, new things, we can do it. I'm sure that with all the frustrations that COVID-19 has created, it's also created moments of satisfaction. And I believe that will be the ultimate story when we get to the other side of this. I'd like to invite all of the panelists, the speakers, to join us now for a time of discussion. And this is where the conversation comes to the fore. And we get to share ideas and continue to pursue these topics that we've talked about in this webinar. The question I'll present to you, Eli, and it's from our student, Yasser, thinking about how seminaries can help students as they cope with the rapid changes and the pressures that they are confronting, especially in the Middle East and amidst all the crises that are ongoing. How can the seminary help students that are experiencing these pressures?
This is an interesting question, especially coming from Yasser. Usually we learn from our students in cases like this. Yasser was uprooted from Syria during the war. He came to Lebanon with a large family, living in very tight conditions, and he's managing to study full-time, and he's doing very well. So people are resilient, and when they have a sense of calling and a sense of commitment to what God is training them for, they can find solutions. No doubt about that. And we're seeing that with the emergency measures that we're going online with our students. For the long-term solution going forward, we will be looking for a different type of leaders to work with. So we used to look for leaders who were able to come to Lebanon for 3 years, and we work with them. Now going forward, we will be looking for leaders who can find space during their week to study with us, 15 to 20 hours per week. They can have internet access and have enough technology to be able to study with us. We see amazing sacrifices among our students. We want to continue to work with them and learn a lot from them as they solve their own difficulties and challenges.
Martin, Hani, anything you'd like to add to that response? We have a question from Joseph Habib. He's asking, how can seminaries with more experience and better capabilities help smaller seminaries that are facing particular challenges? Hani, do you have learning from your experience at ESTC? Yeah. How can that partnership develop?
Sure. Well, I answered the question in written format, and I'm glad to do it in audio format as well. Well, I think the most important thing, the first step, is just to get in communication. I mean, to get in contact and get together and talk about the specific details. You know, the actual realities that a certain institution lives in, certain questions, certain potentials, and other information. And then we can start this journey in a way that makes sense to both institutions. It is part of the existence in anywhere in the world, and it's part of the spirit of ministry, so that we can get together and share the journey. But then we have to get together first. I mean, we need to talk about specifics. That's all. I mean, there are different aspects of such an assistance. It could be an assistance in actually training, providing training, and this could be in different levels. It could be an assistance in terms of strategic thinking and planning, or just simply sharing the experience, and then giving the seminaries, other seminaries, new seminaries, developing seminaries, to the space in order for them to do the thinking by themselves and maybe come back later for further consultation. So it is just joining together in collegial and professional fellowship to share a journey where we make ourselves available in certain ways that make sense to the other seminary. So I mean, it's communication. We have to start with getting in contact and then to find out where to go from there.
Thank you. I hope that this webinar is an example of that kind of communication, and perhaps something we can do more of in the future. Stephanie, Theologians Without Borders existed before the pandemic, but I don't understand, if I understand correctly, not very long before the pandemic. How has this initiative been able to bring seminaries together, or perhaps help seminaries partner in coping with this time?
Yeah, one of the part of the mission of Theologians Without Borders is for regional and cross-regional collaboration of institutions in the majority world in different parts. So as I mentioned, we have been doing interviews with some of our schools and just asking them to share their sort of grassroots level best practices and workarounds, because we know that everyone's facing similar challenges. You can find those on our website. I also know, like you said, this consultation is example. Asia Theological Association has been doing some similar ones, and they have posted their consultations in terms of how to respond, the how-tos. I think you would find many of their situations similar. And then the last thing I'll mention, somebody had asked in the questions about specific training. I don't know if you're familiar with ICET Academy, ICETE, International Council for Evangelical Theological Education, of which Miata is a part. So ICET Academy is running some short courses and even some nano courses that are particularly meant to help you with some of this how-to. So you can check them out and see what you can get from them.
Thank you. Thank you. So Martin, you spoke about strategic students and the changes that ABTS has taken, puts it in a better position to enroll and to serve strategic students. There's some concern and a question from Mike Kuhn that perhaps it can edge into elitism. How do you think ABTS can accommodate that?
Well, of course, we want those with the fattest laptops and the fastest internet connections to be our students. And, it's a very good question. In some ways, we have the seminary is more likely to be elitist if we expect students that are able to leave everything and come and dedicate 3 or 4 years to theological study. I think the current crisis, by forcing seminaries to get closer to the church, is drawn into the grassroots level, where we will have, or increasingly the strategic student for us is a student that doesn't have a lot of time on their hand, who are very involved in ministry, who need our support and our flexibility as we deliver theological education so that we can accommodate the program to their needs, to their busyness, and so on. It's people who cannot afford to leave the ministry. Yet, of course, it can also be, there can be a risk where it becomes an education that's for those who are already leaders, and that could block the way to the emergence and development of new leaders. One typical example for us has been, students who are married often come together as two spouses, and so quite often one of the spouses initially was not planning on studying theology, but because of the nature of the residency permit, both have to be students, and suddenly you find that the person who had no plans on studying theological education and their calling and their vision for ministry. And so the seminary is also a place that cultivates leadership, allows for gifts and calling and vision to emerge. And so there is a risk that would be lost. And thank you, Mike, for reminding us of this. And we certainly need to, it's one of the challenges, and we need to be mindful of making our programs accessible to those who might not naturally come out as natural leaders.
Thank you. We are approaching 5:30, but we are going to extend this discussion a little longer. We were a little late starting it, so we will extend the webinar 10 more minutes to be able to utilize this time together. So hopefully you can see. We have a question from Amir. He is asking about the mechanisms of cooperation between churches and seminaries in the Middle East, and how cooperation can help to lead to peacefully dealing with and overcoming the crises that we're facing.
Okay, I'll answer this one. Thank you, Amir, for the question. Of course, the question could be answered in so many different ways. I will mention right now three major general ways that we can look at this through. Well, first of all, I mean, our self-understanding, for example, as a seminary at ETSC, is that we exist for the church, and this is our raison d'être, if you could say, and this is the reason for our existence. And so this question actually is right on target. So one way to help the church is that the seminary would stay focused on its mission, and the mission is to exist for the church, and in a very specific way to train the servants of the Lord for a more equipped ministry. So that they could become the best they could in light of their calling in their context. So the best way for the seminary to help the church is that it stays focused on its mission of training leaders. And so this would be like a one general way of answering your question. But a second one is to provide theological literature for pastors and church leaders. One of the things that I've become aware of, and I feel, and in our context in the Middle East, and this applies to ETSC, but maybe other schools as well, that our production of theological literature is not enough in Arabic, I mean. The thing that we need to do more is to grow in producing theological literature in Arabic, and theological literature that takes into account the context in meaningful ways, in order to pave our time and our present time for the future. So this is a major way that seminaries could help the local church. And we need to grow a lot in this. The third aspect is just to be an example for the local churches. One challenge in Egypt that we discovered during the pandemic is that, Egyptian people, and everybody knows, and maybe the Middle East in general, they are highly social. And, staying at home is like a life sentence for them, if not execution. And people in the church, although they feel the threat of the pandemic, they don't want to stay at home. They want to go to church. And many of our churches, especially in the rural areas, they would like to go to church every day, even in the middle of the crisis. And it was one of the ethical challenges at ETSC and to many of our pastors, how we can actually help people to be an example, role models at this time in order to save lives. It's not like it's not a trivial matter. It's something that is related to life. It's a matter of life or death. So being an example is a very important aspect on how we can help our churches, the local churches, to act and to act in the time of crisis. So this would be like general ways that I can think of at the top of my head right now that a seminary could help. Of course, there are so many other specific issues that, of course, we can delve into if there are more specific questions and more specific aspects to the question.
Thank you. That's great to hear. We have a couple of questions about theology. Eli, you mentioned one of the challenges is inadequate theology. And perhaps in the last couple of months, as the world has been in a way overcome by a pandemic, what are some other examples of problematic theologies that have come up and that you have encountered? So what are some of the theological challenges that have been presented in this moment? Eli, if you could expand more on the inadequate theologies that you mentioned.
Yes, thank you, Brent. So I mentioned Christ-likeness, whether we play it safe or we get into this self-giving type of Christ-likeness. There are many inadequate theologies. I'm not sure that we can go through them now. I'm sure everyone has their own list. But we've all listened a lot to eschatological discussions about the pandemic and what's happening, and is this a punishment from God? And so it really depends on how we look at the situation and how we interpret theologically what's happening, what God's doing. Is God there to punish and then we should stay out of the way? Or does God want to use us as these mustard seeds in the middle of all of this so that the kingdom of God can start to take shape in the middle of all this badness, all of this ugliness? So theology makes a big difference. I'm sure that we can come up with a long list among all of us.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Hanny, do you have something to contribute as well?
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the issues that we need as seminaries to integrate more in our curricula is theology and culture, the integration or the conversation between theology and culture. Because in this region, religion and theology, if I could use them in like similar ways, they are usually put together in like a separate circle, apart from dealing with cultural issues. And by culture, I mean three main things. I mean, you say culture, you mean art, you mean science, and you mean politics. And here I want to dwell more on science, especially when we're talking about technology and using technology, and the impact of that on the actual ministry of the church, and how we can actually broaden our mind in ways that could keep our core beliefs intact, but at the same time in a way that is faithful to the context, so that we can actually serve the Lord in a clearer way. This needs more integration and more conversation between theology and science. And it is, in my opinion, it is an uncharted waters in this part of the world, and it needs more attention. So that would be another aspect.
Great, thank you. That is such an important point. It's come up in other questions, the intersection of politics and history and economics and science and all these social sciences within theological education. Very important topics. Well, the final question, or let's say exercise, that I'll pose to each of you before we complete this webinar and this time of discussion. Let's transport ourselves to the year 2030. We're 10 years down the road, and you are asked to answer in one sentence, how would you characterize the year 2020 and the pandemic experience for your theological endeavors? What do you answer 10 years down the road from now? What do you anticipate to answer, Lily? We'll start with Stephanie.
I would say that we'll see it as a turning point for schools globally, particularly the less resource schools who never thought that they could do online and distributed education. I think they're going to find out what they can really do.
Okay. Martin, how do you respond?
I look back and I say, well, it completely transformed our understanding of distance and relationship, and had as much an impact on these areas as, say, the two world wars of the past century had on the development of technologies and of labor and the role of women in the workplace.
Annie, 10 years from now, how do you anticipate you'll understand this current time?
Listen, I might sound a little bit creepy because I had turning points in my head, but Stephanie stole it from me. But paradigm shift is the word, and I think it is a paradigm shift. And when I say that, I think we're not going to look at the world in the same way. That, you know, there are certain things that we saw in the past as challenges and barriers. For example, online education. Because I've been through this with faculty and with the students, and it was looked at as a barrier, a challenge to real theological education, and now it's our only shot. And so I think this is going to be a paradigm shift. Yeah.
Eli, 2030, what do we think?
I think we look back at 2020 and we'll think, how did we do things the old way? How did we get away with doing things for 60 years the same way and not changing? So 2020 would be a great conversion point for us. If I may say something, Brent, before we disappear, we are sharing this journey of change with all of our colleagues and peers in theological education worldwide. Not only we don't have all the answers, we're sure that we haven't uncovered all the questions either. So please keep your questions coming and keep challenging us so that together we can figure this way forward.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Hanny. Thank you, Stephanie, for this very invigorating, vibrant conversation. And we do hope it continues in our respective places and collectively as we keep to this important task of theological education. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today and attending this webinar. Please Share your thoughts, share your feedback in the survey that will be linked to you soon. And do join us next month as we continue MEC 2020. On August 20th, we will have our third webinar entitled No Space or New Space, Navigating Exceptional Times as the New Normal for the Local Church. So as the local church was such a central part of this discussion on theological education, next month we will look at this topic, important topic, even more in the context of the pandemic and in the context of the Middle East. I hope you join us on August 20th. Registration for that event will begin next week, so keep your eyes open. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless, stay safe, and we will see you again.